Morning, guys. Today I want to take a little break from our series on the great saxophone players, the Battle of the Saxes. I have the next episode actually already in the can, but I want to take a break, let you guys have a break. We'll get back to it tomorrow. Something I touched on in yesterday's episode, and I want to dive into it further. Obviously, this saxophone thing is so in depth that a lot of viewers just don't have the time to dedicate themselves to it. So I feel like I'm okay to bring this up again. And it's something I've actually been thinking about quite a lot. Laying in bed at night, just kind of factoring and quantifying my theory. And great art. And it doesn't just apply to jazz. It's got engines and it's fueled by different things. And I think it's an important thing that we need to have as a way to comprehend what is an artist saying to us. And it's, by the way, this fantastic Jean de Jazz was talking about this record the other day. Joe Newman with Frank Foster. Outstanding. It's just great. Throat grabbers all over the place, you're absolutely right. But in crime, there's two main energy fuel sources, and it's money, greed, and sex passion. And the number of people in the state penitentiaries that aren't there for sex or money somehow is pretty minimal, you know. There's other motivations at times. Women are more complex. You know, I mean, women will do some shit just for straight pure revenge, spite, you know. But the male is a much more base beast, it feels like. And if it ain't about some pussy, or if it ain't about some gold chips, I ain't gonna do too much about it. But we'll kill something over some money, and we'll kill something over some female. That's what people are in jail for. Any homicide cop will tell you. Money and sex. That's it. You know, there's not a lot to it. And with art, there's a lot of that same principle at work. And I would argue with art, there's actually two additional fuels of consequence, and they're kind of on two sides of two different camps, two and two, and the two are often blurred, but they can be definitely very separate as well. And with art, I feel like you have ego, and remember, ego is driven by insecurity, and we cover up insecurity with intellect. So ego is a complex fuel in art that drives a lot of great art. And it's fine to like art for music or to hear someone's virtuosity for the sake of that, if that's what you want. There's times where I want that. Not always. Sometimes I want to hear a different engine fueling it. But intellect, ego do fuel art. And there's jazz that's definitely driven by ego, and definitely driven. Composition is more often driven by ego than the blues is, you know. And again, the lines get blurred, but ego. Then you have music art that's made for money, and it's often the most soulless of the bunch, the most easy to spot. But even oftentimes that corner, music made for money, can have great merit. It can still have great virtuosity, intellect. It can have the other two elements from the other side of the globe, and those two other elements are struggle, gut, soul. And soul comes from struggle, and you can emote a sense of, I'm here to have a good time, because shit sucks most of the time. For me, for my group, for my people, for my race. And when you are coming from that fuel, there's not a lot else that you need to do besides, oh shit, let's have a good time. And you tend to stay in almost a simple, fun, celebratory sense of the music because it's not about my ego or my intellect. I've shut those things off. It's not about making money. We're here to fucking forget all the shit that we live through on the daily and to have a good time right now. That's what the blues is. And so the soul that we speak of, when I talk about the gut, it's just a guy that I feel like he's just blowing to get through because he makes him feel better. And that's a powerful fuel. And then the fourth fuel, which again to me is interlinked with soul and gut, is sex. And the line is blurry at times between sex and the blues and soul, the gut, because often there's no better way to celebrate my overcoming the blues than getting somebody else's guts. See what I'm saying? So music that's influenced by soul, struggle, and spirit is often interwoven in the same place. Is often very interwoven with sexual motivations as well. And so for me, sexual fuel and soul-driven fuel will both often swing very hard because that down, dirty, and nasty is what's on the table. And so let's not fuck that up. And let's never forget, too, the link between dancing and sex. There's no greater foreplay, preamble, opening to a night of intimacy, especially with a stranger, than some close one-to-one, some Lindy Hoppin'. What you got? Let's stay close. Don't fuck up the groove over there, band. Keep me in my pocket so I can get me some pocket. Feel me? See, I gotta preach a little bit. When I get these long episodes sometimes, these series giving facts and data, they're fun, and I've learned a lot doing it. Sometimes I just gotta speak. And so this whole episode here, we're gonna talk about those four corners of the globe: money, ego, soul, and sex. And I'm gonna give you some examples to my ears, to my interpretations of what I think the four sound like. You got a deal? We're gonna start with this Joe Newman record. This record's all about soul, the guts, the blues. It's certainly not afraid of some sex. It'll entertain that idea, don't you worry. But it doesn't feel like we're here to just be sensual lovemakers. We're here to get through this business called Black in America in 1962 or 61. See, I'm getting pretty good at guessing this shit, even when I don't know. But when you got Joe Newman, Frank Foster, Eddie Jones, Billy English from the Avant-garde label, and Tommy Flanagan, that's just going to be blue. And Count Basie is linked to this. Newman, Foster, I think the bass player Eddie Jones also played with Basie. And did Flanagan play with Basie as well at times? I'm not sure. I don't think he did. But, and maybe Bill English did too, I don't know. Basie guys like to play with Basie guys, because you know what? They play the fucking blues. And that's all I really want to do today is I'm stressed, I'm exhausted. I want to feel better. Let me play you some blues. And blues doesn't have to be limited to one sound or one thing. But you can feel Frank Foster, come on. You can feel the movement, what's propelling it. So gorgeous. And as sexual as the blues can be, its primary motivation and function of the blues is to overcome, to survive. I can grab my coffee. Swinging hard driving blues. Basie's band over the years, man. It's too insane even to list off here. Just so much talent. Read the band. 2 columns of all-stars. Pause there and read those names. It's high watermark stuff. And to be honest here, a lot of artists can cover 2 of these things at once, even occasionally 3. But in artists' careers, trajectories can change. That's one of the important things to understand, is that even in rock and roll, Twisted Sister, Guns N' Roses, Stay Hungry, Appetite for Destruction, those records killed because they were broke, they were desperate, they were hungry. And that hunger fueled an ugly, blues-driven rock that needed to, we're not gonna take it. Welcome to the jungle. See what I'm saying? Even rock has that same conundrum. And now we sold 10 million copies of Appetite for Destruction. And now we're gonna sound like Elton John doing November Rain. And tell me that's not driven by money and ego. So it's a daily struggle for the artist to decide where he wants to plant his flag. And it's tough. And the incentives and motivations are there. And virtuosity isn't necessarily a displacement of ego and insecurity. Virtuosity can be very ego-driven, but you listen to early Jimmy Smith, and trust me, there's some ego in Jimmy's playing. Jimmy will tell you that. Jimmy don't know nothing but how great he is, because he was incredible and blew the socks off everybody. But that's so drenched with the blues, and me finding my worth in this music, me finding my, man, I can pull my socks up and breathe now. I was on the edge for a long time there. This blues saved my ass. See what I'm saying? The 3 sounds. To me, the 3 sounds, and they can have some sexual moments, but they're driven by the blues. And why Jimmy Smith and why the 3 sounds sold well is because it was simple, and its motivation was, I want to feel better. And that honest approach will always have an audience. And yet somehow today's consumer is so consumed by ego-driven, rare, obscure thought music that they ignore and pass over. Oh, that's only $6. It can't be any good. No, it's good because it's sold, and that's why people liked it, and you will like it, and it's got as much feel and gut and soul as anything out there. And if you ain't hearing it, what are you listening to? Oh, I'm not hearing any great virtuosity. You just stay for, okay, that's fine. Stay in the virtuosity camp. But make no mistake about it, virtuosity can have nothing but the blues through it. No matter how flamboyant and virtuoistic, how's that fucking word said, no matter how much of a virtuoso Clifford was, it's not ego driven. It's still playing the blues. It's still feeling his way through his day. It doesn't feel meditated or premeditated. There's no conscious choice of, this is the path I'm going to take when I play my solo today. This is where he felt like going the moment he did it. This is how he felt today. And I can't fake it. I can't play something I'm not feeling right now. And that's the problem with intellect. That's the problem with composition. Is sometimes it makes you play things that you ain't feeling right now. And I'd always rather listen to some shit where my artist is feeling what he's telling me. Coming from the soul, coming from his heart. Integrity, I need it. I don't want ego for ego's sake very often. Because honestly, I find having to prop up your ego exhausting. I don't have enough time keeping my own self afloat. And I listen to jazz music and the blues so I can remind myself, okay, I can get through today. No matter what's going on in the world around me, these cats overcame so much greater than I ever have. And so it fuels me. I feed on it. And hearing some guy talk about how great he is in his egotistically driven intellectual playing, sometimes that doesn't edify me in any way. I'm like, God, this guy's great, but that's all he's telling me is how great he is. He's not really even hearing the musicians around him. This seems so much about you trying to tell me how great you are. And I would rather hear someone tell me how, no matter how tough things were, they're gonna get through it. Big difference. It's a big difference. And so many cats. Hubbard, great virtuoso, stays with high integrity at all times in the blues. Lee Morgan, a guy that plays the blues and from his soul. Milt Jackson, one of the bluesiest guys in the history of this music. Bill Evans. While I feel like there's some intellect in his playing, he plays with the blues. He had an ugly childhood. Watch my episode on Bill Evans if you haven't seen it. And that alcoholism and that abuse and that missing parental familial experience scars him. And so I feel like most of the time Evans is playing directly from his soul. It doesn't feel like it's for money, especially not here at Riverside. It doesn't feel like it's sexual in nature. It's definitely driven by his gut. And then his mind interlocks at times. And so you can see how these lines do blur. That's the blues expression through and through and through and through. She's never sexual, in spite of being a very sexual creature. She's never about money. It never feels commercial, which Ella does at times feel more about money. It doesn't feel driven by ego. She's great because she sings the blues. And that's the only fuel that works in her engine. And so, question yourself. What do you find yourself listening for, liking? Bird, bluesy player. Soulful, gut-driven player. Blakey, his messenger groups, in spite of there being some intellect, especially with the shorter groups later, this is about driving away the demons of a shitty day. You know what I mean? Blakey's about the great overcoming. Willis Jackson, Lockjaw. These cats drip the blues. They're coming up in my sax series, and it's not about you listen to how great a saxophone player I am, because I want you to hear just how talented my abilities are. Lockjaw's not telling you that. Lockjaw doesn't really give a shit about that. Lockjaw's not thinking about, what are you thinking about me and my ability? Lockjaw's thinking about, okay, I gotta keep the water bill on. The light should stay on for another month. Man, got a little too drunk last night. But I had to work till 4 in the morning to pay them bills. So you know what? I'm just getting through. And getting through comes from a different place. And it's obviously, if you can't tell, my favorite fuel. You know, I love to hear a guy just from his soul, telling me, you know what? I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna fucking make it. And to me, that storytelling is what the blues is about. It's the story of all the shit I saw, did, looked at, and I had to deal with today, and yet I'm still here. See, that's a story. And so the blues is always going to be telling you a narration of events if you can hear it. Intellectual driven music is going to tell you the same story every time it plays that song. It's a different fuel. Now, this guy has definitely soul in him, without a question. But it would be hard to deny that Duke Ellington is driven by sex. And there's a sophisticated, debonair, comforting, silk and lacy, why don't you come here and sit on my knee, baby? This isn't about money. And the king of composition here, excuse me, I got to sneeze on the edge here. It's not going to come. He's not playing for ego. Ego throws in all kinds of stuff. Listen to me. Listen to the minimalism. Because soft, vesperous whispers require minimalism. I'm not going to shout in your ear, hey baby, let's go, you're so beautiful. It's hey baby, I got a little something for you. I was thinking about you all day today. All day. So I had to stop by the market and I picked you up a little something because I was thinking about you. And that fuels Ellington. Ellington's sexual. It's what drives you. And again, sex is one of the medicines the blues seeks. And the average bluesman knows that mansion on the hill ain't ever gonna happen. The Cadillac's a maybe, but sweet jelly roll? Best believe I'm gonna find me some of that tonight. Don't matter. I'm gonna find me some jelly roll tonight. Paradise. Paradise. See what I'm saying? Perfect. And you can feel sexuality driving certain artists. To me, Ellington's work is laced with sexual songs. Prelude to a Kiss, The Warm Valley, Passion Flower, it's Moody Indigo, Wanderlust, Satin Doll. It's rockin' in rhythm. You take most of his song titles. What's he telling you about? Now, Miles Davis, here's a guy that lands in every camp. And actually, I don't feel him play the blues very often. You know what I mean? He's not driven by struggle and sorrow, because for a black man, he had very little struggle and sorrow. And like a white guy, he almost had to fake it and fabricate it to create that element at times. But he was too comfortable in his upbringing, and he had drug problems, he had women problems, he had plenty of issues. So you have elements of the blues in Miles, but when Miles is at his best, he's sexual. He's coming from a place of sexual longing, sexual yearning, aching, passion, love denied. That's to me Miles in his greatest element. And when he's great, when he's got that mute to his lips, he's not thinking about making money. He's not thinking about, I need to be the most important jazz guy. I need to keep being innovative. His ego's put aside. He's thinking about Jelly Roll. Sweet, sweet Jelly Roll. And again, some of this is arbitrary and open for debate. What are your ears hearing? But I think if we sat and thought about it, there's 1,000 guys in jazz that play with more blues and guts and desperation, hunger, than Miles. Miles comes from a middle class existence, and that is a different spoon in your mouth. It can't help but not be. But damn, he wants you to lift that skirt up, baby. Come on, lift up that skirt. I promise, I'll behave myself. Don't you worry. For me, Stan Getz, when he's at his best, is a sexually driven guy. And this also kind of ties in with race. White cats come from far more comfort, far more security. And so white cats aren't driven by the blues in the same way. It's not to say they can't play the blues and don't have the blues, but it's not as desperate. The fuel's not as potent. And sex becomes a very strong motivator for a lot of the white players when they're at their best. And white players are actually often more educated, better trained virtuosos. And so a lot of times ego does come to the fore with a lot of these white cats. But to me, what Getz is great is very much driven by sensuality. A guy like Johnny Hodges, of course, Ellington died. Hodges always feels like, ooh, I like that skirt. Hike it up a little, make it a little shorter. I'm gonna stay over here across the room, don't worry. But let me see a little bit of that. Hodges is playful, tongue-in-cheek, naughty. Tell me that brother, I swear to God I know him, you know what I'm saying? Look at that face, that well-grown mustache. The ladies knew what that was about. That's a good time. Chicks know that. Hodges, to me, especially his verb stuff in this era, it's swanky. And again, the lines are very blurred. A guy like Dexter Gordon, to me, Dexter is the great blues and sex. He's got both in spades. He seems to speak about surviving, and there's no question though, for Dex, the only way to survive, she's in row 4. Tell her to come backstage. That's Dexter, you know what I mean? He's always bluesy, and you can tell there's a lot of struggle in Dexter's existence, a lot of pain, and he plays the blues to overcome. But his favorite medicine, Sugar Walls. And so these are the players, to me, Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins. Both these guys are very sexual players, and I hear them chatting with the ladies every time they do their blow on their horn. Great Coleman Hawkins on Emercy, early 26-013 10-inch. It's pretty cool. The 13th 10-inch on Emercy's discography. And so that leads us to the other camp. And now we're talking jazz that's driven by ego. And intellect, like I said, is a manifestation of ego and trying to overcome one's insecurities. Right off the bat, this is not sexual. I mean, just, if this is sexual to y'all, you're having sex with octopus. Nothing sexual about that. Blues, it doesn't feel like a guy telling me his struggle about how much he wants to have a good time tonight. It doesn't feel like he's trying to celebrate with a room full of people or even include them. It feels very exclusive. And ego doesn't mind excluding its audience. It's trying to prop oneself up. So ego is very exclusive. And you can have a one-on-one and sit there enveloped in this guy's ability or his composition or what he's thinking and trying to project to you. But it feels very different. Unit Structures to me is probably my least favorite Blue Note record. It's taken me years to say that out loud. The first 15 years, like, oh yeah, what a great record. And then you sit down one day and you're like, why am I listening to this? Oh wait, I need to throw a bunch of furniture down the fire escape. Perfect, let me put that back on. Because that's what this feels like to me, and I said that before, got a chuckle, and it still feels like that to me. It's dissonant, edgy, frail. It's even got some vulnerability to it, which actually alludes to the blues, but it doesn't feel like it's driven by the same fuel whatsoever. And it's funny how the avant-garde does come along in the later eras of the music once the blues of the black experience was diminished and the level of education was increased. That can't be a coincidence. By the 50s, the 40s, more and more black musicians are getting higher education, secondary education, better training, better instruments. And I think it's no coincidence that as their struggle diminished, their intellect increased, and it changes the fuel of the music. Hancock, to me, this is Mwandishi, which is definitely intellectual driven music. And even The Egg, which I love, that doesn't feel very sexual, doesn't feel very blues, let's have a good time. It feels thought out. And there's a place for all of this. Every collection should have intellectual, sexual, and soul-driven blues. Every jazz collection should have all three. It's the fourth one, music driven by money. That to me is less of an essential. To me, the modern jazz quartet, it's chamber, it's a lot of constructed passages. These earlier ones are actually bluesier than his later Atlantic, his later stuff on Atlantic. But I think for a lot of people what's missing with the MJQ at times is it's not super driven by the blues. It's not super driven sexually. It's more driven by John Lewis's ego and intellectualism. And even Milt Jackson, one of the bluesiest players of all time, sounds and feels different. Me and Jean-Michel talked about this. Milt feels different playing with MJQ versus how he sounds on his solo records. That's the great Milt Jackson, one of the great players in jazz history. So records like this, more MJQ, it feels more driven by intellect. Alice Coltrane. I'm not a big fan of Alice Coltrane. I've always found her very, I'm going to speak gently here, but I feel like she's famous because of her husband. And if she didn't have that name Coltrane on the end of her name, she'd be an art student that no one knew. She has some talent and ability, but I don't feel this great spiritual connection from her. I feel like she's a bit of a beneficiary of some great circumstance. And her records are loved by the spiritual jazz fans, but often music I find that's trying to be spiritual often isn't. And I don't feel this is driven by the blues or sexuality. It's driven by intellectualism, and it's a different fuel. And I used to like her stuff more, but it's just a place I don't go very often. Jimmy Joffrey, I've been loving his records lately. Super soft avant-gardism, but it's very intellectually driven. It's not driven by the blues. It's not driven by sex. It's driven by ego, thought out innovation. And innovation, when it's thought out, it can be kind of apparent. Mingus, he walks the line. And there's times where I feel like he's very much driven by intellectualism. Oscar Peterson, he's a Canadian, as am I. That being said, his experience as a black man was different. And so Oscar, while he's capable of playing the blues, never quite feels the blues quite the same. And by the end, his stuff's driven by his ego, his fantastic virtuosity, and eventually it's driven by money, because those later Verve records are fairly commercially driven, and a lot of the Impulse, Creed Taylor, a lot of the Verve stuff in the 60s with Creed Taylor is across the board. Money's a definite part of that package because of how they were even presented, those records. You didn't sign with Verve and didn't realize that you were going to be meddled with by Creed Taylor and management to create a polished sound and look that was going to appeal to a lot of people. Miles Davis, Bitches Brew. To me, this record's completely driven by ego. And oftentimes there's 6 egos talking over each other. There's no unity. There's no groove. It's cacophonous, vacuous, soulless, bluesless, sexless. It's just ego-driven, trying to climb a mountain and I need to be brilliant. People need to see how talented I am. And Miles' ego, Miles' insecurity. Miles is an incredibly insecure cat, and a lot of his ego is a compensation for that. So you see Miles functions across the board. And speaking of Miles, to me a record like this was driven by money. And it sold well, kind of proving my point. These records with Gil Evans were some of his best-selling records, and they were done with intellectual Gil Evans arranging these pieces, composing things that were European tradition, so a large white audience would buy it. You might even not know that's a black guy who made that. And so, to me, a lot of the Gil Evans stuff, it's consciously driven by a desire to cross over, a desire to reach a big audience, a new audience. Knowing on some level your old audience has kind of left you. And yet, this is an outstanding chunk of music. I love this record, but it doesn't change that it's being fueled by a bit of a commercial engine. We're gonna trim the fat a little bit and be a little bit more accessible so that as many people can buy it. And it sold near 1 million copies in the day, which is unheard of for jazz in that time. I think it even outsold Kind of Blue in that moment. Kind of Blue has since passed it, but Sketches is still one of Miles' best-selling works. And I have a hard time thinking that that wasn't part of what was driving it. To me, Wes Montgomery is a classic example of a guy with an incredible virtuosity, an incredible amount of gut blues that eventually goes to Verve and makes some very commercially driven music. And he had 7 kids. Is that right, Wolfgang? Jazz Journal this month coming up on my Patreon page. My friend Wolfgang Pointner is doing a great article on Wes Montgomery. We're going to be covering the great drummers. Should be a fun episode to watch. And as great as Wes's playing is still here, there's not a lot of blues to what Wes is telling you right here. And it doesn't even feel like it's ego or intellectually driven. This isn't him saying, I'm going to be the most complex improviser, with the most complex charts and arrangements ever. It's not being that. It's being a commercial product. And it's great for being that. It's great. To me, Getz, this bossa nova stuff. I love these records, don't get me wrong. They're outstanding. But Getz knew that they were making good money with this, and so they stuck with that formula for a while and made a lot of bossa nova records and made them all some money. And you feel that's part of the engine at times of some of those records. It's almost listless at times because it's not passionate. And I feel the earlier ones were more connected. The later ones become more formulaic. Brubeck. To me, this record, Brubeck's not a blues guy. He can play the blues, but he's not driven by great sorrow the same way as a Lockjaw Davis. He's not necessarily a sexual player, he's a cerebral player. Desmond has a great deal of sexuality to him, but Brubeck's more intellectual. And I would even go so far as to say money-driven. He was a founding member of the Fantasy record label. He was big into contracts, numbers, and the money side of this way before most guys have even put their first diaper on. His focus was very early on owning his tracks, owning his music, being part of the business side of things. So he was always approaching his next release as, oh, this is kind of current right now, let me dabble with that. This is a new Broadway hit, let me play some of that. Oh, he's a composer, he has some success in that film, let me do some of his arrangements. He's very much driven by being successful financially. And again, there's nothing wrong with it. And he makes some outstanding records. But I feel like a lot of the criticisms and things I read and hear that people say in post are kind of revealing what I'm saying without them seeing what I'm saying. I don't feel like a lot of people get that the Lockjaws and Willis Jacksons are so bluesy and basic, and that's why I don't really dig them, because they don't really get it that way. And the last guy I want to talk about, well, actually the last two guys. Two guys especially in the history of jazz to me that don't really have category. And it would be Charlie Parker. They are just both beyond category. Coltrane definitely makes a few records with Creed Taylor that were a concession. Ballads, Hartman, records that were with Ellington, gonna sell pretty well. But his even most out stuff, it never feels driven by ego necessarily, as much as it's driven by a desperation to conquer and fight the source of the blues. Instead of him just trying to have a good time tonight, which he does at times, he feels very much like if he slays the dragon, he can put an end to the blues. That's a whole different approach. And Coltrane doesn't really exude sexuality a great deal. I don't feel like he really ever was driven by money. Ego doesn't seem to really even be a part of his virtuosity, his innovation. It doesn't feel ego-driven. It feels like it's driven by a certain desperation, different than the blues. But like I said, it's one that wants to slay the dragon to put an end to the blues for everyone. That's a whole different category. So Coltrane, you're kind of on your own there, brother. And Parker, I feel like he's kind of in that same camp. For all his innovation, it never feels like it's ego-driven. It feels real natural. He saw something while playing and practicing the blues that allowed him to play the blues faster, more efficiently, with more notes, more steps of the scale. I can throw all that shit in there. It never felt like it was driven to be like, let me change the face of the music. It just felt like I could express my sorrow better, given those extra steps, alternate pathways for me to express the blues. Parker has some sexuality to him at times, but he's definitely a blues-driven, sorrow-driven guy on the edge of being drunk, high, just desperation. And he definitely is a guy that's tough to categorize, because you don't think Parker's really ever playing for money. And maybe some of the stuff with strings, but he plays for money not to get rich. He plays for money to get high. And that's kind of a different motivation as well. But again, he's not an ego-driven player. He's not a money-driven player, except for getting high. He's not really a sexual. He's a guy driven by the blues. And he definitely is harder to categorize than most. So that wraps up this episode. I just wanted to dive into that a little deeper. And then have each of you ask yourself, what do you like in your jazz players? Or any music for that matter. Do you like Appetite for Destruction better than you like Use Your Illusion? Do you like Master of Puppets better than you like Enter Sandman? Do you like the Commodores or do you like Lionel Richie? Different engines motivated that stuff. And it's the same with jazz. It's the same with all art. And it's the same with crime. There's some crimes of ego. I want to prove I can rob that shit just so I can show you I did it. But that kind of crime for show, that's more in the films. There's not a lot of guys out there risking time in jail to steal a Fabergé egg only to return it just to prove they could get it. And as fun as Oceans 11 and 12 and all that stuff were, that type of criminal, it's fun, but not super common. Most crime is done by desperation, by money, blues and sorrow, or sex. Shouldn't have been messing, but you had to go mess. So now I gotta make a mess. So, again, there's not a right or wrong here. This is a you ask yourself and tell me, which fuel do you like best? If you say you like intellectual-driven music that's about ego, I get it. And for me, a lot of the 70s, John McLaughlin's, Schofield's, Matheny's, a lot of that stuff feels very ego-driven. Fueled by my great virtuosity and ego ability, and it's never connected with me. And in part because I didn't come to it until I had matured quite a bit as a wine jazz listener myself. And you mature as a listener, you know what I mean? And it's just where I've come to. And I sure do love me some Black Saint and a Sinner Lady once in a while, to delve into that complex arrangement, ego-driven, but it's a fine line. It's a fine line. And ego has a much smaller place in my life in terms of my art than sexuality does, and definitely than the blues soul struggle. The blues soul and struggle is what medicates me, helps me survive my day, not you telling me or showing me how great you are. Don't really care how great you are. But if you're going to tell me that as tough as it is, it's going to get better and we're going to be okay, that's what I want to hear. That's what I need. That's what we all need some days. Y'all be safe. Guns N' Roses. It's so easy, baby. Take that night train. Peace.